You're listening to the Beyond Measurements and Image podcast, where we build healthier lifestyles, elevate your well-being, and transform lives. Welcome to BMI.
I'm your host, Dr. Drew Crawford. I'm a board-certified gastroenterologist and obesity medicine specialist. Thank you for joining me today on Beyond Measurements and Image. Today we're going to discuss two diets that are quite similar to each other. Both diets start by putting you into ketosis. So if you haven't listened to episode 22, where we talk about the keto diet, I would encourage you to go back and listen to that. So the difference between, let's say, the keto diet or the ketogenic diet and these two diets is that the keto diet is just that. It's this first phase of these other two diets permanently. And although it is good for losing weight, like we discussed in that previous episode, it's very difficult to sustain. The nice thing about this is that it starts you off in that phase, so it gives you some exposure to the keto diet and allows you to have some rapid weight loss at the beginning. And I think one of the advantages of that is that it gives you a little positive feedback. And once you start losing that weight, you begin to maybe see a little bit of the light at the end of the tunnel. It's short-lived, but it's built upon with three other phases where you gradually reintroduce carbohydrates in varying forms, which then I think makes it a much more sustainable diet. And each of these diets, phase 4, is where you're trying to balance the reintroduction of previous foods into your diet. One of the problems that we know is, at least 80%, if not closer to 90% of people who lose weight ultimately gain back all of that weight. And the reason being is they have a target goal of losing weight. So they want to lose, let's say, 50 or 100 pounds or whatever their goal is, 10 pounds, whatever it is. They lose down to that, and then they go back to the same bad habits that they had. We've talked before about an alcoholic doesn't stop drinking for 30 days and then say, okay, well, I'm not an alcoholic anymore. Or I'm not dependent on alcohol, and then go back to the same bad habits, right? It's a permanent lifestyle change that they have to deal with every single day. And I think that's true of all addictions, and food is no different than that. And so these two diets basically recognize that and allow you the freedom to reintroduce. The trick is you have to have the self-discipline in that phase 3 and phase 4 of each of these diets to be able to reintroduce the appropriate foods, and at times recognize when foods are not going to work for you, and to discontinue those and to re-add things in, and to balance your carbohydrate intake and your macronutrient intake with your activity. That being said, let's discuss the two diets. The first diet is the Atkins diet. The Atkins diet was very popular in the 1970s, and it was promoted by a cardiologist by the name of Robert Atkins. We'll talk a little bit more about Dr. Atkins, but essentially what he did was he divided this diet into 4 phases, and this was long before the keto diet was popular or maybe even heard of. But in phase 1 of the diet, it was markedly restrictive of carbohydrates, right? Remember, we talked the typical American diet consists of around 400 grams of carbohydrates daily, which is way too many. But in phase 1 of the Atkins diet, he limits it to 20 grams of carbohydrates per day. Protein is your primary macronutrient source, protein and fats. But it's a high protein diet, which I think globally is very good. It just has to be sustainable. And so on a keto diet, I think it's difficult to sustain that long term. But with the Atkins diet and the Dukan diet, you have a short period of ketosis where you have significant weight loss. And some of that weight loss is going to be water weight because there are a lot of fluid shifts with that. But you're still going to have some sustained weight loss. And it's going to encourage you to eat protein and fats as your macronutrients. And remember, both of those are more satiating. So in other words, when you eat protein and fats, you tend to feel full quicker and longer, but more importantly, you don't have those big spikes in insulin. When you eat carbohydrates, you have a significant rise in your blood sugar. So the insulin comes out, it drives the sugar into the cells, which then causes the blood glucose to drop. And as that drops, it signals our brain that we're hungry and we need to eat. If you're a diabetic and your blood sugar drops, you definitely get that feeling, right? But just as a organism, our bodies are programmed that when our blood sugar drops, we have to eat. So if you eat a diet that's high in carbohydrate, your blood sugar goes up, your insulin level rises appropriately to drive that sugar into the cells, and then the serum blood sugar drops, which then stimulates you to eat. So it's a bit of a vicious cycle. So then as you eat more carbohydrates, you have that oscillating blood sugar level, and as it drops, you're hungry again. And so by having a high protein, high fat diet, you really attenuate that, right? Those blood sugars don't go as high and then they don't drop as much. And so you have not only macronutrients that make you feel full quicker, which then allow you probably to take in less calories right off the bat, but then you have a more sustained sense of being full and you don't have these rises and drops in blood sugar that ultimately cause you to eat more and more. So in the Atkins diet and in the Dukan diet, the second one I'm going to talk about, both of them, they start with this first phase where you're limited in carbohydrates. So you're essentially really negating that whole process that I'm just talking about. You're just eating a lot of protein and a lot of fat. And in theory, that should make you feel full quicker and you just don't eat as much and you begin to lose weight. And then in the second phase, what they call the ongoing phase or the ongoing weight loss phase, you begin to increase your carbohydrates a little bit, maybe by as much as 5 or even possibly 10 grams of carbohydrates per week. So remember, you started with only 20 grams per day. And so now you're beginning to increase that, let's just say by 10 grams per week. So it's not a big increase, but you start to reintroduce foods, some vegetables, some non-starchy vegetables, maybe some whole grains, and it begins to sort of reintroduce those carbohydrates into your diet, but you continue on basically a high protein, high fat diet. And then in the third phase, you further increase the carbohydrates that are allowed. And so you begin to have a much broader range of foods that you can take in. And then on the fourth phase of this diet, you have some more freedom to increase carbohydrates more. And in this phase is you really begin to balance your physical activity and your carbohydrate intake. Remember, carbohydrates serve as the initial fuel that your body wants. And so if you're out being very physically active, the first thing that your body's going to burn is going to be carbohydrates. So if you have that, then you can burn it. What you don't want to do is take in excess carbohydrates. So then your body burns whatever it needs, and then it just begins to store the rest of them ultimately as fat. Again, remember, and I know it sounds like somewhat of a broken record, but remember, fats aren't the problem with obesity. It's really carbohydrates are the problem. Too much calories is the ultimate problem, but really too much carbs accounts for most of that. You want to balance your carbohydrate intake against your physical activity. And that's a bit of a guessing game. And you have to kind of dial that in. You're going to overshoot and you're going to undershoot to some extent. But you can see in this diet that it puts you into ketosis on the front end and you begin to lose weight. And then it gradually increases you through more carbohydrates. The trick is that you have to be able to self-regulate in that phase 4. That phase 4 is sort of a lifelong phase. And remember, we've talked multiple times about the need for dietary changes to be lifestyle changes, changes that you can sustain for life. So in this diet, I think it's a good diet in the sense that it maps out a plan for you that you can follow to begin the weight loss process. And you can see some success on the front end, and then you gradually are able to add back in carbohydrates. But you have to be careful not to add back in all the crap that you were eating before that led to the overweight or obese status that you were in the first place. So that's the Atkins diet. Now, that's a proprietary diet. You can do this same type of diet without paying the fee. But if you need that guidance, the Atkins diet and the Atkins program is still around. Now, let me talk about the second diet that I want to talk about today, and it's called the Dukan diet. Dr. Dukan was a French doctor. I believe he was a neurologist, actually, which is kind of interesting because neurology and obesity and weight loss, they don't necessarily really go hand in hand or speak to one another. But he had an interest in this, and he had a background in nutrition. Now, I don't know if that was a formal background or if that was just from being a physician, but he developed the Dukan diet, which is remarkably similar to the Atkins diet. He actually named the phases of the diet. So the first phase is what he calls the attack phase. And it looks like it lasts anywhere from about 3 to 7 days. And again, he's putting you into ketosis. So he's markedly limiting your carbohydrate intake. It's interesting. He's big on bran. So he allows you in this first phase to have about 1.5 tablespoons of oat bran. And what that is that gives you a little bit of carbohydrates. And then a requirement of this is 6 cups of water daily. And then from there, it's only lean protein. So this is a very high protein diet. And on this first phase, which like I said, lasts about a week, it just consists of lean meats, fish, eggs, non-fat dairy. There's actually a list of proteins. I believe there's 68 animal proteins that he allows you to have in this first phase. And again, this is ketosis. This first phase, this attack phase, is a very short phase. It actually depends on what amount of weight you want to lose. I believe they say if you want to lose about 10 pounds, you only need to be in this phase for a couple of days. Up to about 30 pounds, maybe up to 5 days, and then over 40 pounds, maybe up to 7 days. It's interesting, though, that first phase, getting into ketosis, if you're only going to be on this diet for 2 days, it's unlikely that you're really going to get into true ketosis. Again, I think it's a beneficial approach. It's very much like the Atkins diet, although I think the Atkins diet phase 1 or the ketosis tends to be a little bit longer. But what it does is, again, it just introduces you to the concept of ketosis. It actually puts you in ketosis if you're adherent to the diet, and you see some success on the front end. So that's phase 1. Phase 2, very much like the Atkins diet, begins to introduce more carbohydrates. And actually, they go from like 68 animal proteins up to 100 unlimited and allowed foods. What those consist of, again, is all the lean proteins, right? The 68 lean proteins. You can go from 1.5 tablespoons of this oat bran all the way up to a whole 2 tablespoons of oat bran. And that gives you some carbohydrates. But then it also allows you to add non-starchy vegetables in an unlimited quantity, such as like zucchini, celery, lettuce, onions, mushrooms, eggplant, green beans, cucumber. Those are all just some examples. Also up to a tablespoon of olive oil daily. And then this phase of the diet is recommended that you be on this for approximately 3 days for every pound that you want to lose. So remember the first phase, the attack phase, anywhere from about 3 to 7 days. That's the ketosis. And then this one, you begin to increase your carbohydrates, just like the Atkins diet. And then you stay on this phase, what he calls the cruise phase, for 3 days for every pound that you want to lose. And then you go into the consolidation or the maintenance phase. Consolidation phase, you begin to add back even more carbohydrates, particularly fruits, cheeses, whole grains, some breads, whole grain breads, of course, some pasta, ideally whole grain pasta. And in this phase, you have a pure protein day where you just have one day where you eat nothing but protein. So it's a little bit of a ketotic type of day, except for you probably don't actually go into true ketosis. Through the attack phase and the cruise phase, the first 2 phases, you should have lost down to the goal weight that you had. So this phase, it's not 5 days for every pound you want to lose. It's actually 5 days for every pound that you lost. If you haven't got to your goal weight, you shouldn't be kicking into this third phase, which is what he calls the consolidation or the maintenance phase. And then the last phase is what he describes as the stabilization phase. And in this phase, he basically cuts you loose to go back. There's no real restrictions on diet. However, there are 3 strict rules that he wants you to adhere to. 1, consume 3 tablespoons of oat bran daily. 2, take the stairs whenever possible or walk at least 20 minutes per day. And 3, have a pure protein day a week. For whatever reason, he recommends Thursday. These different diet plans oftentimes have these sort of quirky little caveats to them, like this 1.5 tablespoons of oat bran up to 2, then permanently on 3. One of our previous diets strictly forbid caffeine, but if you were having green tea, it was acceptable. So again, I think some of these little nuances are just quirks of the diet, just things that the developers or the inventors have a penchant for or believe that they're helpful, but I don't know that the science is behind that. The Atkins diet and the Dukan diet, I think, are very successful diets. I think they really work well because they phase you back in to normalcy. The trick is you just have to make sure that you are doing your part on the normalcy, right? If you follow these steps, you will lose weight. Caloric restriction, particularly in this fashion, is going to be very beneficial. But then when you get to phase 4 in either one of these diets where you're basically turned back and allowed to kind of do the things you want, you have to watch what you're eating and you have to make sure that you're getting the physical activity that you need and that you balance the carbohydrates. I think both of them are good. I think they're very similar. The Dukan diet is still a proprietary product that's out there that you can get on their website and do it. I've seen people that have been on it have had great success. The problem is if they don't sustain that phase 4, then they just go back to where they were. Dr. Atkins, what happened to him? Well, Dr. Atkins died when he was 73 years old. There's conflicting reports, but it's reported that about 2 years before his death that he had 30 to 40% of his coronary arteries blocked. Now, according to his cardiologist, that information was based on incomplete medical records, so I don't know that as a fact. The typical nutritionist would tell you that, yes, that makes sense. If you're having a diet that's high in saturated fat, that you should have that. But again, I would argue, and I think most people would argue, that saturated fats, although they can cause some elevated cholesterol levels, as a general rule, they don't cause tons of problems with coronary artery disease. And to have 30 to 40% blockage is not ideal, but at that age, it's better than probably a lot of people. What is kind of sad, though, is it does appear that he was obese when he died, maybe weighing as much as 258 pounds. He may or may not have had coronary artery disease, but it does sound like he had cardiomyopathy. I don't know if he was adherent with his own diet, but if he was, this doesn't speak great of it. But I do think that it's a good diet. I think it's a solid program. I don't know that the proprietary part of it, I don't know that paying money to do this is necessary in 2025 when you can get all this data online. So let's talk briefly about Dukan. Pierre Dukan was a French physician. He was a neurologist and then also reportedly a nutritionist. I don't know if that was by formal training or just by virtue of the fact that he was a physician. In the end, essentially the French licensing board asserted that he had violated their medical code of practice by practicing medicine as a business. And then in 2012, he was removed basically from the board of medicine at his request. What's interesting, in 2014, he ultimately was completely removed from the medical registry in France. The reason being was that he was promoting his diet commercially. I can't say that I'm knowledgeable about how French medicine works in any way, shape, or form. But could you imagine in America if we struck people, corporations off of the registers, off of the boards, and out of business based on the fact that they were running a medical practice as a business? I mean, think about big pharma. Think about all the medical supply equipment. You know, the big companies like Medtronic and Boston Scientific and Stryker, all of the people that supply medical devices to physicians and hospitals. And big pharma, all the money that they make, right? Those are publicly traded companies where they make profits that then are shared as dividends to the investors. And I'm not saying that that's bad, but I'm just saying that's how American medicine works, right? It's capitalism. It's just how things work. And maybe it's to excess, maybe that needs to be re-examined. But there it is. We've talked about so many diets. We talked about the Pritikin diet, the Ornish diet, the paleo diet, the keto diet, the Mediterranean diet, and there are a whole lot of other diets out there. Today we talked about the Dukan and the Atkins diet. And I hope you found all of them interesting. I think that from all of them, at least from my opinion and looking at those, high protein, high fat diets are much better than high carbohydrate diets. And I would encourage you to listen to each of those and form your own opinion. What we do know is that at 2 years from the time you lose weight, 2 years out when they look at it, the diets that are most effective are completely independent of macronutrients, right? We know some people are on high carb, low protein, high carb, high fat, low protein, you name whatever combination you want. We know that the one thing that determines sustained weight loss up to 2 years out is your ability to adhere to it. So it doesn't matter exactly which diet you choose. It's just the ability to adhere to it and be consistent with it. So I've got one more diet that I just want to tell you about. It's probably my favorite diet of all. One of my favorite people. It's a guy named David Goggins. If you don't know who he is, I strongly encourage you to look at it. He's not a nutritionist. He's not an exercise physiologist. He's a former Navy SEAL. He's absolutely insane. He was a guy that I believe he weighed 297 pounds and within 6 months or 9 months, put himself on a diet and ultimately ended up becoming a Navy SEAL. He's done multiple Ironman, ultra runs. He runs marathons. You name it, he's done it. And again, he's over the top. But he posted something on Instagram the other day, and this is his diet. And I would say this is probably my favorite diet because it kind of gets to the heart of it all. And it starts off by his workout plan and then his diet. So Goggins says, people always ask me about my diet. So here it is. It's a steady diet of wake your lazy fucking ass up and get it in. High protein and low and give a fucks. Stay hard. So maybe that's not the most realistic, but in the end, he's right. Consistency matters, right? Getting up and doing your workouts, whatever they are, whether they're walking, lifting weights, or running 200 miles a day like this guy. Or if it's just altering your diet. Remember, weight loss comes from dietary changes, not so much from exercise. I hope you found all of these different diets useful. At some point, we'll go back in and talk about some others. There's the intermittent fasting diet that we probably ought to talk about at some point. But I think we've kind of exhausted this for the time being. So we're going to switch gears and go with some different things over the next few weeks. I appreciate you listening. That's all I have for today's episode. I'm your host, Dr. Drew Crawford. Join me next week as we go beyond measurements and image to build healthier lifestyles and elevate your well-being on the BMI podcast. See you then. The BMI podcast is provided for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute providing medical advice or professional services. Be sure to check out our description below for our website and social media platforms.